The other remark I'd like to make, maybe first of all, before I proceed any further, let me just slightly give you an illustration of this. Also, to say that merely to begin to sort of theorize about theology does not correct this situation. No doubt everybody here knows the name of Newton. Most people would say, certainly I would say, that he was perhaps the greatest scientist who ever lived. But perhaps most of you don't know that in addition to clearly doing enormous, if not quantity, certainly enormously great work in sciences, he wrote approximately 1,300,000 words in theology and approximately 650,000 words in alchemy. So we're talking about, putting these two together, approximately 2 million words that he actually wrote in his own handwriting. That doesn't mean that these are all his own creation, in the sense some of them are something that he copied, books or manuscripts that he wanted to keep for himself perhaps. We don't know really why, but he made many copies. But in his own writing, 2 million words in his own hand. And throughout his life, he was very occupied with these questions. In fact, on more than one occasion seems to have said that his scientific pursuits were really merely diversions for him from his real concerns. Furthermore, he believed, and said so in so many words, that he was himself a member of an ancient brotherhood that included, for example, some Chaldean priest scientists in Babylonia. He even mentioned some Brahmins in India, and among the Hebrews, Moses, among the Greeks, Pythagoras, and that this brotherhood was in possession of prissa sapienta, a pristine knowledge, primordial knowledge, including even Newton's own inverse square law of gravitation, that this brotherhood in fact knew all this knowledge. And all that Newton was doing was to take this very knowledge that was known to the ancients and put it in the modern language. Quite rightly, he said, Moses and Pythagoras and the others had put this in the mythological or metaphysical language because that was the language of their times, which people could understand. And now he was putting it in the mathematical language, which was the language of his time. But in spite of all this, let me invite you to think that now one would say that Newton surely is as interested in matters of theology, everything else. Nevertheless, there is no indication at all for us to be able to say from looking at his life history that he was a wise man. And I keep returning to this question of what does it mean to have wisdom? Because it is, I think, practically all historians of science or historians of Newton's life would agree that he remained more or less throughout his life a suspicious, vindictive, paranoid, hateful person. And whatever our understanding of wisdom is, we are not likely to consider such a person wise. The greatest of all scientists, furthermore interested in theology, etc. What I am therefore also trying to say here, that we need not fool ourselves into thinking that all we need to do is, if physics people could just take a course in theology or take a course in alchemy, then it'll be all right. Something else is required. It's a whole radical reorientation of one's inner attitude, which is the sort of thing one means by saying quality of life, freedom from ego, freedom from fear, craving, etc. One, also the reason why I made the remark about the Chinese being Chinese is that we need not forget ever, and this is a bit of a danger, particularly imposed upon the scientists really mostly by philosophers, I am afraid. One need not forget that science is done by alive human beings, not sort of a program of automatons who are churning out science without their own sense of commitment to it, without their own follies that come into this, without their own cultural conditioning that comes into it. And this is where one also has to realize that we are now entering quite a new era, not because there are new theories in science, but because science itself has created a new cultural situation. Let me give you an example of this. And I have many other things to say, but I'll save them for later on other than giving this example. Kepler, who is one of my really favorite scientists, with Einstein, who regarded himself really as the priest of God in the temple of nature, this is exactly his expression, was entirely convinced, and said so in writing, that the sun was the Father, and the outer periphery of the solar system was the sun, and the whole intervening space in the solar system was the Holy Ghost. You see, it's to be expected that a person who has a certain cultural background, as he obviously did, a Christian, in his case Lutheran background, naturally sees in the images of science or anything that he himself worked on, ideas and echoes of his own background. But now what is new on the cultural scene brought about by science is really almost precisely the fact that in the honor rolls of physics now, one can hear, in addition to standard European names like Chin Yin Yang, Chandrasekhar Venkata Raman, Tao Dung Li. You see, what is this going to do? Hideki Yukawa, Abdus Salam. All of these names I just mentioned to you now bring cultural sensibilities, metaphors of their own backgrounds, languages, lullabies that they heard were different from European lullabies. So it is not to be surprised at that whereas Kepler could see the sun as the Father, etc., and the Holy Ghost, that some of these will now see the dance of Shiva in the cloud chambers, or they'll see the yin-yang symbol in the complementarity principle. But in neither case does it really amount to anything more than an internal individual wish for a person to make a sense of his whole feeling. So when we think about what is new that has been brought about by modern physics, I think it is, in my judgment, really an error to think in terms of new theories that therefore demand a new metaphysical interpretation. That is also interesting to do in a way. It goes on, that kind of natural theology. But what I feel is particularly new on the world scene is, in fact, even the very fact that we are sitting here right now together, and a character like myself who looks different, who talks differently, whose color is different, whose background is different, that he can actually be sitting here speaking. That is the new part. And it is not going to do anything except force everybody who pays attention to this to come to wrestle with the fact that now there are other cultures which also exist. There are other points of view, other philosophies, other times. That sort of necessarily forced upon us awareness of cultural pluralism. That is one of the most important functions of modern physics or science generally, which has indirectly brought this situation about. Well, I'll stop here because there are really many other things I want to say.
All right. Let's turn to Dr. Jones, who, you have quite a bit of time to.
These two guys are hard acts to follow. I think I'm just sitting here myself trying to get my back on the track of what I wanted to say. One comment I can't resist making right away when you were talking about plumbing and ancient wisdom. Einstein was once asked if he had it all to do over again, what he would like to be, and he said a plumber.
If he had gone into it, we'll probably be talking about plumbing.
Right. I want to try to do two things. One is to talk a little bit about the role of consciousness in modern physics. And the other is to give a contrasting view of the world from the point of view of a different kind of consciousness, a medieval consciousness in terms of astrology. So I want to try to do those two things briefly as a kind of a follow-up to what I was introducing last night, the idea that that there is a tendency to idolize our symbols and our metaphors and our models and to treat them as literal and actual. there's been a lot of lip service given to the idea that modern physics has, in fact, opened the doors finally to consciousness. If you look in the history of physics in the last 400 or 500 years, as Ravi was saying, this duality has been present, as also Rene was talking about. This duality has been a prominent feature of modern science, and people recognized all along that this was a problem, and all this uneasiness, I couldn't agree more, that Ravi was talking about. So many people have recognized it and not known what to do about it. And people thought that with 20th century physics, at least there was a crack in this barrier, in this wall. Without trying to be pessimistic, I want to argue against this point of view, and I'll try to make this argument briefly. Modern physics really consists of two major revolutions in thought, and one is called relativity, and the other one is called quantum theory. And both of them seem to finally give some place to consciousness, some role to the human spirit, if you like. Let's look at each of these individually for a moment. In relativity, it is said that the description made of the world, in particular in terms of the space and time that we can measure, depends upon the state of motion of the observer. And therefore, the observer comes into the act for the first time. In the history of modern science, it had always been a sort of a precept and unspoken, but nevertheless absolute, that the external world was completely separate from the internal. We're going back to Descartes. And so this is one way in which we see this dichotomy, this split. But with relativity, for the first time, the observer comes into the act. And we talk about the frame of reference of the observer, and that the kind of descriptions that are made will then depend upon this frame of reference and state of motion. I don't think this really gives any concessions to consciousness, although it sounds like it. A lot of it just has to do with language. By frame of reference here is really not meant any kind of state of mind or state of consciousness of the observer, but rather just the apparatus of measurement, the local system of measurement, or laboratory, if you like, from within which the observer makes the measurements. So frame of reference doesn't really refer to any state of consciousness, nor does even the act of observation, because the act of observation, from the point of view of relativity, can be carried out as much, if not better, by a completely automatous and non-living creature. And we've had marvelous evidence of this in the recent photographs and data that we've gotten from Saturn and Jupiter, after all, which are bodies that are millions and millions of miles from us, which no human being, to our knowledge, has ever visited. And yet we have the most elaborate and beautiful and detailed information, which was all an act of observation carried out by a computerized television system and floating laboratory, in effect, which was able to take all this data and then transmit it back to us. So the act of observation in itself does not imply consciousness, does not in any way imply the participation of a living being or a conscious entity. So I think partly from the point of view of language, because the language in relativity seems to suggest a subjective point of view. Frame of reference doesn't really mean that. And the act of observation, too, really doesn't refer to consciousness. So I think that the implication that relativity involves consciousness or brings consciousness into the act can easily be discounted. It's not a real serious entree of consciousness into science. The other case, the case of quantum theory, is more subtle and deeper. The simplest way to see how consciousness enters into quantum theory is in terms of what may be considered perhaps the fundamental philosophical tenet of quantum theory, which is called the uncertainty principle, which says that certain kinds of measurements cannot be made to arbitrary accuracy. It is a combination of energy and time, or distance and momentum, but the details there are not important. What it says is that there is a limitation, many people interpret it this way, on human knowledge, that the act of observation itself introduces a non-predictable element into what is observed, so that the act of observation cannot be separated, and what can be known about natural phenomena therefore does depend on this act of observation. This seems to be a much more fundamental statement about the effect or amalgamation of consciousness with the natural world. First of all, the observation, as an act of observation, I would make exactly the same criticism that I made about relativity. The act of observation need not be performed by a conscious or sentient creature of any kind, just as much as in relativity. It can be done by automatic recording devices and computerized methods. And so there's no implication that because an observation is being made, there is necessarily any consciousness behind it. That's number one. Number two, even if we do say that consciousness has something to do with nature, with natural things, the role assigned to consciousness in quantum theory is the most trivial imaginable role. It is a very weak and passive role. It is simply the act of observation. It might equally well be done by a worm or a microbe as much as by a human being, let alone by a computerized television system. It is a role in which the sheer act of observation has an effect. There need be no intelligence, no thought behind it. The characteristics that we associate most significantly with consciousness, and that are most important to us when we think about consciousness and what consciousness means to us, have no part at all. Such things as creativity, such things as will, intelligence, they are not involved in this. It is the sheer act of putting an observer in front of nature, presumably, and recording the information that somehow produces this effect. So it isn't the imaginative and the creative and the original and the willful aspect of consciousness. In other words, all of the essential ingredients of consciousness that make us human, that make us unique as conscious beings, really are not involved in this act. So that if it is consciousness at all, it is only at the most trivial level and does not involve the higher functions of mind and thought and imagination. And finally, and I think this to me is the most important criticism, that whether consciousness is involved in observation or not, whether it affects it or not in some direct way, ultimately, quantum theory is still very Newtonian in the sense that it ultimately expects to explain the entire world in material terms. Whatever this consciousness is, whether it may interact with nature or not, or how it may affect it, it is still ultimately seen as the consequence of the random, purposeless action of material forces and entities in the universe. It is still that kind of a reductionist view. Consciousness, from the point of view of physics, of the physical sciences, is still ultimately seen as an epiphenomenon, as people say. In other words, the consequence of certain kinds of molecular or atomic acts which come off to have, on the whole, things, special properties that we associate with life or consciousness, and yet which have no real meaning or significance or purpose of their own. So that even though consciousness may be recognized as an essential ingredient in the cosmos, it is still trivial, it is still meaningless, it is still insignificant. I think quantum theory ultimately pays no more attention and gives no more credit to the idea of meaning and value and purpose than did classical physics. So I believe that although it looks like relativity and quantum theory have in some sense opened up to consciousness, I think in the deepest sense they have not. I believe in the deepest sense quantum theory and relativity are just as reductionist, just as material, just as mechanistic as Newtonian physics was in the final analysis. Furthermore, and I think this is a very dangerous point, it relates very closely to what Rene was saying, that this is not a dualistic theory. If only it were, it would be easy to attack. Ultimately, this materialist, reductionist, mechanistic is a monistic view which attributes everything to matter, but to matter in a trivial and meaningless way. It ultimately says consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a consequence of material forces which themselves have no meaning or purpose or value. So that ultimately there is not a split, there is a unity, but a material unity, a purely material unity. In other words, consciousness means nothing, doesn't even exist. Again, as an example, I think I give the extreme version. Not all behaviorists say this, but in the extreme version of behaviorism, again, the mind is excluded, thought is excluded, soul is excluded. So that, in a sense, modern science is monistic. It is not dualistic. And yet it is a monism which completely excludes any sense of meaning or purpose or significance in the universe. Again, totally antithetical to the idea of spirit or purpose in the cosmos, the Platonic Pythagorean idea of mind in space, of a cosmos of meaning and significance. It is antithetical to that idea. In contrast with this, I would like to just discuss briefly the worldview that preceded this now 500-year-old material mechanistic approach to the world. In terms of the medieval astrology. Medieval astrology is perhaps the last and the most understandable version of this alternative view in which mind and matter are at least seen, if dualistically, at least seen as combined, organically involved, or participatory universe. And I realize that bringing up astrology, especially in a science seminar, is very dangerous. People today tend to discount astrology, tend to look down upon it, to think of it as superstition and meaningless and just a leftover remnant of an earlier primitive anthropomorphic kind of approach to the world. Well, one of the main reasons that this is so, one of the main reasons that people have so much trouble accepting and thinking about astrology in a meaningful way today is because they try to fit it within the modern idolatrous framework. We think of nature in terms of a rigid, empty, vast space in which phenomena produce, as causes, produce effects at other places. And so we have this whole idea of causality, which is a fundamental foundation to all of our notions in science today. And it is extremely difficult to try to fit astrology into this causal spatial framework. A modern scientist will say, there is no known phenomenon which can take place on Mars or Jupiter, which could somehow have a long-distance effect raying across millions of miles of space to somehow interfere with or affect things that occur on the Earth. In particular, somehow affect the genes of some embryo in the process of formation and somehow determine the character traits of such a child prenatally. So that because it is inconceivable to explain the ideas of astrology within the modern scientific framework, it is ruled out. It is excluded from consideration, even without thought about the data. And I don't want to get into how accurate or predictive astrology is, because once again, those are scientific criteria. To talk about how effective something is, how good a black magic it is, to use Ravi's term, is to use the criteria of modern science. Once again, it's hard to apply those to astrology. But the point I'm trying to make is that even without a consideration of the data, of the accuracy, and so on, astrology is ruled out on the basis of the fact that it does not fit within a causal framework. Right there is, I think, a primary act of idolatry. It is once again saying that the criteria and the methods of judgment of science are the only ones that are valid, and anything which doesn't fit into them is excluded as a possible description of reality or an approach to truth or a philosophy of the world. The interesting thing about the medieval frame of mind is that it does something which we have lost sight of. And Ravi brought this point out very well. He said, we've lost the appreciation of poetry today. When we look at medieval art, medieval culture, it has a certain strain. It appears odd or quaint to us. There's something unfamiliar, something uneasy about it. We see pictures in which things are combined that seem to us not to go together. Angels in a horse cart, for example. It seems incongruous to us that something metaphorical and mythical and imaginary, like an angel, could be combined with something mundane and down to earth and of this earth, like carts and ordinary people. We see angels dressed in ordinary clothing, or people wearing angels' clothing, and so on. There seems to be this strange mix of the literal and the metaphorical, as we would term it. We see a separation between the literal and the metaphorical. And another way of seeing this dichotomy that Rene is talking about is in terms of this, that there is a difference for us between literal and metaphorical. I submit that for the medieval mind, this separation, if it existed at all, was not nearly so sharp. That just as they did not feel themselves, their skin, to be a boundary between an outer world and an inner world, in the same sense, what we think of as the imaginary realm and the real realm were not so separate and distinct for the medieval mind. And this is very clear if you look at astrology and alchemy. Astrology is decidedly not a system of statements and descriptions and laws that relate some outer physical geometrical realm with some inner subjective realm. We might say today it's difficult for us to accept astrology because it seems to try to combine two different realms that have no bearing on one another. What we would call astronomy and what we would call psychology. But for the medieval mind, I don't think what astrology and astronomy, or astronomy and psychology, were separate. They wouldn't think of them as separate things. When an astrologer says that there is a mercurial trait in a human being, that astrologer does not mean that somehow the planet Mercury is producing some physical phenomena which travels across millions of miles of space and then affects in a causal way. Rather, that astrologer is talking about the inner relationship between all kinds of phenomena. It's difficult for us to conceive of this. Fortunately, the great psychologist Carl Jung has coined a term for this. He calls it synchronicity. Carl Jung says that when you, for example, walk along the street and meet a friend that you haven't seen for 10 years, and just 5 minutes earlier thought of that friend popped into your mind, and you say, what a remarkable coincidence, but that's all it is. You think that there's no significance or no meaning. Again, discounting any possible relationship between these two events because there is no causal explanation. But there is another whole realm of connectivity, of relationship, which has to do with the level of human meaning, the level of human significance, which Jung describes as synchronistic. In other words, if we go back to this ancient idea that the world is fundamentally a unity, which somehow is taken apart, or at least appears to us as taken apart, then it's only natural that we would find reflected in all the different parts the other parts. In other words, each part of the world, since it's a fundamental unity and the separateness and the divisibility and the multiplicity is an illusion, then each part is somehow a reflection of everything else. There's nothing at all surprising about the fact then that a human being should reflect mercurial traits, traits of swiftness, traits of variability, traits of communicativity, and so on. All of these are things that astrologers talk about as mercurial. And a medieval astrologer, when referring to mercurial traits, doesn't mean specifically physical things as opposed to psychological things, but the amalgamation of all of those things, that there is a mercurial principle in the cosmos, which is sometimes reflected in a planet, sometimes reflected in a mythological god, and again, you don't separate the mythological from the real realm. Sometimes reflected in an element, a mercurial element, which is variable and quixotic, sometimes reflected in a psychological trait, sometimes reflected in an astrological principle. All of these different things are just reflections of the same underlying unity. And the relationship between all of these things cannot be described in causal terms. It is not a matter of geometry. It is not a matter of a causal effect traveling through space, but rather it is a reflection of the idea that everything is unified and there is a synchronistic relationship among all things, and alchemy and astrology reflect this idea. So that we see in astrology, perhaps for the last time as a unified theory or approach to the world, or at least in the West, we see for the last time a systematic, and I hate to even call it systematic and a school of thought and a philosophy, because it was more of a way of perceiving and experiencing the world than it was just a system of ideas. Of course, astrology had a formal side to it. But medieval people actually experienced themselves as more closely related to the world in the way I said American Indians do last night. I was talking about this feeling of being a part. The word participation, again, going back to Aquinas, this whole idea of taking part in the universe, being part and parcel of the universe, of the underlying forces and principles and potentials within the universe being expressed now in one form, this whole idea of potentia and actus, which was so central to Aquinas' thought, the idea that there are fundamental principles in the world which can be expressed or made manifest in different forms, is simply reflected in astrology and in alchemy and in the medieval point of view. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to at least present this idea as an alternative view. And let me just take the last few minutes to at least try to present the idea that there is some controversy in this little conference. It's remarkable to me how much we're in agreement. So I have to go out of my way to try to find some little bone to pick on. So I'm going to try to at least bring up a few issues that I want to mention. In some cases, in fact, they're really more agreement than disagreement. I want to mention, I mentioned the duality and the unity that you talked about, Rene. Another thing that, at least a way of seeing what you talked about earlier, this idea that that there is an evolution of phenomena, that there is a precedence of whether the subtle comes first or the gross comes first, or vice versa, whether we begin with matter and derive spirit or begin with spirit and derive matter. All of these issues, I think, if you look at it from this unified and synchronistic point of view, disappear in some sense. Even time, after all, is a kind of an idol for us. Even time is one of the ways in which we break up the world and spread it out. In some ultimate unified realm, there is no space and time. Everything is one, everything is unified, and there cannot even be a question of precedence or derivation or descent or ascent. All of these ideas, again, are connected with our precepts, with our notion about the physical nature of time and space as external forms of reality. So that even this idea of which comes first is again, in some sense, idolatrous, in some sense, acknowledging that these concepts of space and time have some absolute validity, that we can make judgments in terms of them, and that if we get stuck in that dualistic or multiple or diverse frame of mind, then we're forced to try to deal with these questions which become unanswerable, which become paradoxes and insoluble. Because if you take a unity apart in any way whatsoever, then you must arrive at paradox. If something seems separate, which is ultimately unified, then the question of how it can be separate or which came first ultimately arises, and there's no way of answering it if you realize that ultimately you are dealing with an illusion, that there is no separation to begin with, there is no descent or ascent. So I just wanted to make this comment that, again, astrology, in some sense, has a wiser, if you like, point of view towards all of this. And then a couple of comments I wanted to make about Ravi's, two things that Ravi said last night. In answering the question about the purpose of life, you brought up this question of, you raised this idea, which is so almost oppressive to think about, of 100 million deaths a year, and the idea that how can we avoid thinking about that our individual lives lose significance, they reduce us to almost a meaningless position in the universe when we contemplate these 100 million years. Well, I want to at least raise the issue that in some sense what you're doing, again, is to quantify the problem. That it is, again, a kind of a scientific approach to bring numbers and statistics and quantity and to say, look, there are 100 million people dying every year. We're on that list someplace. We're going to be included. How can it be significant? Well, I think that without attempting to discount that, I don't want to belittle it or diminish it, but the point is this for me, that those kinds of arguments tend to do, to me at least, I feel intimidated by them in the same way that I think I was talking about last night, how people feel intimidated by this scientific view of a vast universe in which, as a result of random processes, human beings have come about, and that you begin to feel yourself so meaningless and insignificant that you become insecure and fearful and anxious about it. I think that's what quantity does. It kind of does that to us. After all, you don't experience your life that way. In your lifetime, how many deaths will touch you directly? 20, 30, 100, possibly. Probably not even that many. If you think in terms of the people who are really close to you, death is a very immediate and a tragic thing, but it's personal. It isn't abstract, it isn't statistical, it isn't hundreds of millions or even thousands of deaths that concern you. It is only the deaths of those immediately around you. And they somehow are gradually integrated and absorbed into your life so that you can, however tragic or terrible they may be, you somehow reconcile yourself to them and your life carries on, it becomes integrated. You can't begin to deal with this idea of 100 million deaths. You can't begin to deal with the consequences of a nuclear holocaust, the megadeaths, for example. There's a concept that's incredible, megadeaths. Now, we've even quantized the notion of death. This is the kind of thing that I mean, that science of its nature, this attempt to quantify the world, to discount the human issue by casting it into quantitative terms, is a tendency that has been very destructive. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about such things, but this tendency, I think, to kind of belittle and reduce people to it sort of kind of strikes you suddenly. What am I compared to this 100 million, this womb and jaw that you talked about? You can sort of put it in these dramatic terms quantitatively that seem to reduce us to nothing, but that's not the way you experience your life. And it's only this, because of this scientific approach, that we're able to do these kinds of things. Well, I just want to raise that issue without trying to discount it. I just want to raise the issue of what those kind of arguments do to us when we hear them. And finally, one other thing that I wanted to raise about what Ravi was talking about. You talked about this idea that perhaps the main idea behind wisdom is to overcome craving and fear. And certainly this makes a great deal of sense, and this is fundamental in Buddhist philosophy and Eastern thought generally. And I would like to just suggest that one of the credits that science claims is in fact this idea. Many people who work in science say that it is science which enables us to rise above the cravings and the fears of our mortal existence. That by contemplating the universe at this abstract level, it becomes possible to absolve yourself and remove yourself and become more objective about the world, and to stop concerning yourself with anthropomorphic issues and human issues, and see the universe in larger terms and more cosmic terms, and see the human predicament and human desire and needs as less significant. It's true that science claims this, and many scientists, in fact, see this as almost a religious or spiritual quality in science. And many scientific lives look that way. People seem to have become purified by this long process of concentrating or emphasizing science. And yet, to go to the other point that you made about judging something by its fruits, despite this ability of science perhaps to purify us, to raise us above these things, the fruits of science, as we know only too well, are to have created the most destructive potential that the world has ever known. So again, I just throw this out as a thought that was at least came up in my mind in thinking about what. So I'm going to stop now.
Thank you very much.